All right, in Chapter 13, we're going to look at victims in the 21st century, alternative directions. So, what about, what are some sort of, interesting topics today? What about retaliatory justice? When are we using legitimate use of force in self-defense versus vigilantism? So on the news recently during Dr. Nassar's sentencing, there was a father who was there giving a victim impact statement. 3 of his daughters had been abused by him. And what he asked for was 5 minutes alone in a room with the man. And the judge said no. And then he asked for 1, and the judge said no. And then he went after him. So what are some things that really shape self-defense statutes? One is punitive rationale, okay? Necessity, individualist rationale, and social rationale. So first thing we want to think about when we're thinking about a legitimate use of force and self-defense is that the threat posed by the aggressor needs to be imminent. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about domestic violence and battered women syndrome. You need to be facing a threat right now. If you're not facing a threat, then you can't use force. If the offender is retreating from you, they are no longer a threat, so deadly force is not justified. Whether or not a victim believes they're, facing harm, it needs to be reasonable. The force used needs to be proportionate to the threat, and the timing of the victim's action needs to be appropriate. So one thing we might think about, and we hear about, in some other states, is arming teachers or arming different people. So would victims be better off if they were armed? In 2011, about 50% of all households had access to a firearm. What are some arguments advanced by proponents of arming themselves? Well, reaching for a gun can save a victim's life. It might make somebody feel safer and instill some peace of mind. Would-be criminals might think twice if they know the person they're attacking has a gun. Brandishing a gun may cut short an attack. Firing a gun may save a victim's life. And that people should be taking responsibility for their own safety, and they should be prepared to defend themselves and their families. On the other side of this argument, though, is there are far too many guns in circulation already. Very few victims draw a weapon in their own self-defense when under attack, and getting a gun for protection actually puts its owner in greater danger. We also know when we think about victim provocation and when we think about violence as a situated transaction, introducing a gun into a conflict actually increases the odds of it escalating. Some quote-unquote law-abiding citizens who own guns for protection may actually use them to commit crimes. People who own guns for protection may turn them on themselves. Guns owned for protection can accidentally discharge. And victims might lose shootouts against someone who's better armed or more ruthless. So here we can see we have from 1988 to 2013 trends in justifiable homicide. So we've got by officers with the round dots and by victims of crime with the square dots. You can kind of see that pattern. You can see that they're pretty similar in terms of peaks and valleys. So, we can take a do-it-yourself approach towards retaliatory justice. We might think about back alley justice, street justice, frontier justice. So vigilantism often arises as a response to victimization, and that idea of retaliation appeals to many Americans. I think amongst people who saw the video of that father go after Dr. Nassar, most people are very sympathetic about that. But criminals can be vigilantes too, right? So gang shootings, mafia hitmen, etc. Our author notes that transforming victims into offenders and offenders into victims is not the solution. We already have too many offenders. We don't need victims to become offenders through retaliatory violence. So one model that we've seen in more recent times is what's called restorative justice and peacemaking justice. So restorative justice draws upon non-punitive methods of peacemaking, mediation, negotiation, dispute resolution, and it really embraces the themes of the victims' rights movement. The idea here is to make the victim whole again and to bring the interested parties together in order to determine how we can actually do that. Whereas retributive justice is state-centered, offender-focused, punishment-oriented. So one thing we often see, and I guess probably the most well-known part of restorative justice, is alternative dispute resolution. And this already happens in other parts of the legal system. So mediation, which is direct negotiations between two people who have a dispute. Conciliation, where there's a go-between that facilitates the flow of information. And arbitration, where a neutral fact finder is called in to break deadlocks and impose a fair, final, legally binding decision. So how does reconciliation work? Restitution is a symbolic gesture and a prerequisite for reacceptance of the community. One of the things restorative justice aims to do is to not only make the victim whole again, but to then figure out how, once the offender has sort of paid their dues, to welcome them back into the community. This provides basis for forgiveness, and only the community can provide reintegration. What happens then is a third party facilitates and oversees that process. And here you can kind of see in this chart a comparison of restorative versus retributive justice. So this could take the form of neighborhood justice centers, informal justice. I would say probably, when we think about restorative justice today, for me, it always kind of brings up the idea of conflict resolution in schools. So one thing that, a piece of restorative justice that is borrowed from the Native American culture is a peacemaking circle. This is a Native American tribal culture, has developed a consensus about how to restore harmony to afflicted individuals. So as I mentioned before, we get interested parties, those with a stake in the outcome, neighbors, community groups, religious groups, etc., together. In New Zealand, they use what's called family group conferencing, and they use this with juveniles a lot. Offenders describe the ordeals to relatives, friends, neighbors, and the victim explains the impact of the crime upon them. In both of these approaches, then, the group determines the appropriate sanctions. So one thing that this does is it gives victims a little bit more of a say in what the outcome is going to be. So what are some pros and cons from a victim's point of view? Well, we can resolve a conflict without making an arrest. It allows them to ask more questions about why and how. It's speedier. It's cheaper. Healing and redemption undermine justice and responsibility, though. There's no protections for the accusers the way state courts do, and it's closed to the public. So a blameless victim may feel cheated if a compromise involved the offender. And not all victims want to participate in something like this. So moving forward with restorative justice, more cases will probably be referred. We have to think then about how will the system handle it. If it's overworked, if you try to streamline it, does that compromise the process? And most serious cases don't seem to be a good fit for this. So again, if we think about something like sexual assault, the victim's unlikely to want to sit down with the offender. Okay, and that wraps up that chapter.